Okay, back to the USE League games. I'm still in catch-up mode here from 2022. Let's begin with the game against Rondom. To avoid confusion, this is a new game, but I did play Rondom in the last round as well. In this game, Rondom is controlling the Axis and I have the Allies. He begins with a simple invasion of Poland in 1939, and this happens occasionally. The Poles hold under the attack. Essentially, this comes down to Warsaw. Danzig, Posen, Lodz and Krakow will fall. You can afford to lose 3 units and still hold on as long as Warsaw holds. And you need some luck to achieve that. Poland will almost certainly fall next turn, even if October is poor weather, and there's a good chance it won't be. And there's a good chance there'll be fair weather in October. So what difference does this actually make? Well, probably the biggest shift is in the Diplomacy Cup. You see, in this game, the Axis have added no pro markers to the Cup. So that creates the obvious risk of an Italian activation, which can happen if the Axis draw a political failure and the Western faction draws a political success. And it's the nightmare opening result. It's about a 1 in 40 chance. And should pretty much always result in an Allied victory in anything except the long opening. Ideally, you want to avoid it like the plague, and obviously the best way to do that is to add pro-Axis markers to the Cup. They reduce your chance of drawing the political failure and the Western player's chance of a political success. Which is why, ideally, in any opening move, a player takes Denmark and either Hungary or Poland on the first turn. That adds 2 markers and shifts the odds to about 1 in 60. Poland did fall the next turn. As Western player, I pulled a political success. What to do with that? Place it on Italy or remove the pro-Axis marker for Romania. I'm playing defensive here and went with removing the pro-Axis marker, and the Russians just put the no event back in, so that the Germans had as complete a no-event cup as possible. Denmark is likely to fall fairly soon, so putting a marker into Italy, a pro marker into Italy, didn't seem worth it. It's just going to get removed. And Denmark did fall in fair weather in November 1939, without a chance for the UK to put any troops in, and thus no Copenhagen Gambit in this game. The dreaded political failure for the Axis in November. The Western faction does not draw success, and I play defence, putting the political failure back in with the Soviets. The Axis are not in a good position to make another conquest to remove the marker anytime soon. It looks like Rondom is lining up an invasion of Norway. I'll want to contest that with British and French troops if possible. The key point is that there are 4 ports in Norway outside of Oslo. The British can drop troops into them, as can the French, and the ability of British-French convoys to supply the troops far outweighs that of the Axis. However, the real key is Stavanger. A fleet in Stavanger can intercept German supply in Oslo, but you need to protect it from the Luftwaffe, which can attack it from bases in Denmark. Quick note on that. Because of the home defence rules, the British cannot commit fighters. But the French fighter, if positioned northeast of Calais, can fly directly to Stavanger when you land troops there. Obviously, if Sweden enters the game in any of these Norway scenarios, it's all over. The Allies can contest landings with just a German army around Oslo, but they obviously don't have anything like the number of troops necessary to defend the long front Norway has with Sweden. The Axis attack goes directly into Oslo. I often say it's suboptimal to land directly into a port rather than next to it, but the Allies can force the move by positioning the second garrison to the northwest of Oslo. In general, it's better to execute this attack with a panzer, both for the extra +1, which improves the chances of success, and also because the panzer is more effective once it's ashore. There is a chance of failure here in poor weather, and there is a big question about whether the Axis should commit the paratroop counter. And of course, whether Norway is worth the trouble at all, but that one's not the topic for today. Okay, so I commit to the Oslo Gambit. Just to explain some terminology here, a gambit is a chess term where you give up a pawn early in the game to gain a positional advantage. I use the term in unconditional surrender to refer to early game decisions by the allied player, who, remember, has no strategic decisions to make. Instead, there are moments where at a potential cost, in this case to weaken the defence of France, the Allies can throw a spanner in the works. A little precision thing I was looking at here, which I kind of spotted later, is that in future I think I want the British unit at Trondheim and the French unit at Stavanger. But overall, I think this is a good commitment on the Gambit. We're in January. It's going to draw Axis attention. The Axis are ashore with an infantry unit, which I have a good chance of stopping. It doesn't look like Sweden is likely to enter. So, all round, I think this is a good situation to take the Oslo Gambit in. Rondom responds by beginning the battle for France early, in February, by picking off the Netherlands. This is entirely sound. You take Netherlands out without attacking Belgium, which means you accelerate the Western forces by 1 month, but you get a much better position to launch the attack into France from. It is usually used to gain an additional month in April or May. One, I think, unintentional effect here is that it frees up my Mediterranean units, allowing me to bring more resources to bear in Norway. And that's where the carrier will be going. I'm going to lose the battle for France. That is inevitable against competent Axis play, and Rondom is good enough not to make an error on that. But if I can take Norway, especially since the Axis have no pro markers in Sweden, I've secured Scandinavia for the rest of the game. Shipping an extra unit to Norway for the Axis is an error. The convoy has to spend 2 sorties to do it, and that makes a successful interception, which I get, much more likely. I've repositioned the French fighter so that it can intercept next turn. The surface action will be back again, so that will escort the convoy and give them a better chance of getting through. By March, the German units are in a bit of trouble. They can be maintained on limited supply from Oslo, but the Luftwaffe have allowed themselves to be drawn north into a slugging match with British and French forces, which prevents them supporting the attack on France. If I can keep the convoy pinned down, then I have a chance when fair weather breaks, before the French fall, of taking Oslo. And if I can achieve that, that's going to pay dividends in the endgame. Pull a ceded area marker from the cup with the Soviets, and I have to make a decision around Bessarabia. It's a tricky region. It's a net morale loss of 2 points for the Soviets, but it deprives an Axis allied Romania of fact. On the other hand, it makes Romanian entry very likely. But I have a preference for keeping Lithuania out of fighting, forcing the Axis player to attack it, and Karelia is a no-go. Finland entering the war pro-Axis is just very bad. So here, since Romania has a pro-Axis marker and might well be activated anyway, I choose to take Bessarabia. It's April, Rondom moves on Belgium. It's still poor weather. You might be wondering why Lille is empty. The reason is fairly simple. I intend to strategic move the British unit to that location once the attack begins. The Diplomacy Cup here is interesting. It's sitting at a 5 in 6 chance of a German success, which I'm presuming they would spend to put a pro-Axis marker into Italy, and makes it pretty likely we're going to be looking at an Italian activation by the Axis fairly soon. I've stripped the Med in order to support my Oslo Gambit, so if Italy enters, I'll have nothing available to put up a fight there. Though that isn't actually what's about to happen. I don't succeed in intercepting the German convoy, which allows the troops at Oslo to be supplied again, and the German forces managed to take Belgium out of the war and captured Sedan despite the poor weather. However, The result is they only have 13 production points left, which gives them a problematic choice. They can afford to reinforce the convoy and one fighter, and that is it, if they want to spend the 5 production points for a diplomacy action. And Rondom is about to make a mistake here. Rondom is about to start spending the production points to reinforce Luftwaffe units and to forego spending on the diplomacy cup. May is usually fair, and it is here. The Axis attack through Sedan and it drives the French back with some disruptions. But there are real dangers in this position. The strike towards Paris has no supply because you can only really route that through Calais. If I can hold Lille, the 2 panzers will be in a supply trap. Even if Lille falls, one of the panzers is still going to be in a supply trap. As it happens, I'm going to lose the UK unit to virtually the first attack by a German unit. My very first video was on probability and why you need to understand probabilities for this sort of game, because if you don't, you tend to make false assessments of why things worked or didn't. This is a really good example of that. I commented to Rondom that they got lucky taking Lille so quickly and pressing on to Calais, and thus avoiding both panzers being in a supply trap. And it became apparent that Rondom did not think they were lucky. Rondom had advanced over the Marne and into Paris, simply assuming that subsequent attacks, Paris then Lille, would succeed and therefore the supply wasn't a problem. But as you can see, it's a real edge shot for the first attack to take Lille, and it's only 50-50 to take the city at all, even once it's surrounded. Like I say, that's kind of important because the game hinges on assessments of the likelihood of certain events happening. And if you're miscalculating that, and you're misattributing the result, you look at a situation and say, oh, I didn't succeed because I was unlucky, when in reality you didn't succeed because you were always very unlikely to succeed, then you're going to struggle to consistently get results. Oslo falls in June. I don't advance the French unit, but instead halt it and advance the British in to avoid any funny business when the French collapse. By the end of June, the French are hovering on just 1 or 2 national will. Remember, the Axis have been spending their production points on sorties instead, as they really should have been, on the Diplomacy Cup, which now sits with a very realistic chance of an Italian entry. There is a pro-Western marker in Italy. One of the 3 counters will generate an Italian entry. In case you are wondering, in this situation, if the Axis had spent the production points for a diplomacy action, it is better spent drawing a token. Drawing a token gives the Allies a 1 in 6 chance of a Western entry for Italy, as opposed to the 1 in 3 chance of nothing happening, while adding a political failure and a no event results in a 1 in 5 chance of a Western entry for Italy. The Axis don't do any of this because they don't keep the 5 production points for diplomacy, and Italy does activate as a Western power. So this is basically game over here. Rondom will eventually take Italy out of the war in December, but is never able to completely drive the British out of the peninsula, and the 1941 invasion of Russia goes badly. By the end of the Russian winter, the German army is in full retreat on all fronts. Germany finally collapses in May 1943, which Rondom gamely plays out. I'm not sure how much of this I will cover in further episodes, as the hiatus put my diary significantly behind the actual league games, and in a sense there is a real inevitability to this after the Italian entry. A little editorialising here. By this point, by the time I was playing this game, it was clear the design team on Unconditional Surrender were not happy with Italian entries, of which there have been quite a few in the league. About 20% of the openings where that's a thing have resulted in an Italian entry. But part of the problem here is the design team's general unwillingness to engage with actual data playtesting or analysis. They seem to actively want to use anecdotal remarks from inexperienced players in preference. And this is a really good example of that. Italy should not have joined the Western Allies here. It required multiple consecutive errors by Rondom to get to that 1 in 3 chance. And while it's hard to say because you cannot replay BGA games, my suspicion is that most Italian activations for the Western powers in the league resulted from similar scenarios. Relatively new players not understanding the risk they are taking and it being exploited by an opponent like myself. Who the results happened for does broadly bear that out. But I suspect those weaker players are reading the Italian entry as a feature of the game rather than a result of their play, and therefore reporting to the design team that they were unlucky and that needs fixing. The change which is being proposed is to require 3 successes, and will almost certainly, I think, have come into effect by the time this episode airs. I'm not sure that that will really do what the people involved think it will do, but we'll have to wait and see them. Anyway, let's move on to my next game. My game against WKSP is going to be a long opening. I'm keen to play a second league long opening, and this time I'll be playing against an opponent who is not only at the top of the league, but also has played a defence against a long opening before. So this will be genuinely interesting. Oops, silly error. The Denmark border, hex 2322, counts for fulfilling the western element of the German home defence policy, so I didn't actually need as many units on the French border. I could have freed up one of the infantry for attacks elsewhere. Anyway, no great difficulty taking Denmark or Poland, so I pick up my 2 pro-axes counters. As I just got through discussing in my last game, I'm after those 2 to minimise the chances of a first turn Italian entry resulting from an axes political failure. I use my conquest of Poland to place a pro-axes marker on Romania, and I get lucky and draw a political success. So I now have a choice: activate Romania or place a marker to begin the activation of Italy. Generally in this situation I prefer to activate Romania, but I'm about to make a mistake and it's worth talking about it. I failed to take Hungary in October, and the Soviets managed to destroy the garrison at Sanauti, which threatens to take Romania out of the war. It's worth noting if the Soviets had positioned a Russian unit at setup northeast of Sanauti, then that unit could have reached Bucharest in a single move. That is hex 3041, by the way. So there is a little bit of obscure opening strategy. You should alter the standard Soviet setup to put a unit in that hex and probably 2 supporting units nearby to create a breakthrough in this scenario. Nearly lost Romania, not a fun experience. Note I'm deliberately gumming up Sanauti's retreat now that I've retaken it to prevent it being lost again. As long as I keep Sanauti gummed up so it cannot retreat, the Russian forces will not be able to dislodge it in bad weather. That's just a weird function of the way the weather rules work, which restricting you to assaults, and therefore I can't lose enough national will to take Romania out of the war. Political success for the Western faction, and they add a counter to Italy in November. So we'll take a look at the situation in the next video.